So I was scrolling through Reddit the other day, as you do, and I saw this post of this guy, this humorous caption, this humorous Photoshop, and I'm like, alright, I know who this motherfucker is. People in the comments identified the guy as Steven Crowder, and despite Reddit's general left-leaning nature, everybody in this comment section seemed to talk about him as if Steven Crowder was some kind of respectable guy, and I gotta say, I was kind of surprised because I had previously only seen contempt from both sides of the aisle for this man. And his terrible, smug sense of humor. So I thought maybe that I'd skewed perception of Crowder. After all, most of what I'd seen of him had been a while back, and the only recent thing I knew about him was about him chickening out of a climate change debate with internationally renowned DILF Peter Hadfield. I thought, perhaps a little bit naively, that he wasn't as bad as I remembered, so I went in and checked one of his new videos. The first one I saw was Vox Rebutted, Gun Control Propaganda Debunked. And I realized as I was watching this, that the Steven Crowder I had cooked up in my head actually differed from the Crowder I was watching. He wasn't quite like the guy I had imagined and remembered, except in all the ways that it was exactly like I fucking pictured it, and just the most smug motherfucker.
Steven Crowder, you a bitch! Ay. Steven Crowder, you a bitch! Ay. Steven Crowder, you a...
You know what, first off, if you're on the right and you're watching this, chances are you're going to roll your eyes and I'm out here defending Vox. Oh, Vox is so terrible. This is something that I can somewhat understand because I too have seen some truly duplicitous stuff put out by them. For example, this propaganda piece explaining why it's all cool that Drake started saying ting out of fucking nowhere because he's from Toronto, even though Drake lived in some fucking suburban ass fucking neighborhood. He clearly doesn't have a fucking accent. Okay, fuck. This gets to me. But the point is, I get it. Vox makes slick, pop-political content that sometimes doesn't back up what it says with proper arguments, even if I genuinely agree with their message. But I'd say most of their content is actually fairly well-researched and relatively fairly presented, and this gun control video fits into the well-researched camp rather than the terrible Drake apologism camp.
Steven Crowder, you a bitch! Ay. Steven Crowder, you a bitch! Ay. Steven Crowder,
One of Crowder's first points is that Vox uses the term mass shooting without defining it, and that the source doesn't define it either.
She uses the term mass shooting. Well, mass shooting isn't a legally defined term. It's not even specifically defined in her source that she includes.
This is untrue and misleading. The definition of a mass shooting shows up a minute into the video, and he's wrong in saying that their sources don't say it either, because this is addressed in the companion article and the literature references in several places. Crowder tries to use the fact that there are multiple definitions of mass shootings to cast doubt on all the data Vox compiled for the first part of this video, but in reality, they give the criteria they use in the video and the companion article, so there really isn't any issue here. Next thing Crowder does is complain that the first Vox chart that's shown is not even per capita.
Now, right away, the chart she uses is misleading because it's not even per capita. The United States has more population than many of these countries combined.
Which is true, but not that good of a point when you consider that just about 16 seconds after we were presented with this chart, we get the per capita version of it. I don't know why he included this in his video. Steven, when you made this response, were you going bit by bit making a list of all the mistakes you saw and were just too lazy to not cut this one out like fucking CinemaSins?
When you look at her original source at PolitiFact adjusted for per capita rates, the chart is nowhere near as drastic, with even Norway, Switzerland, and Finland having more fatalities and deadly mass shootings.
Of course, the US is a much larger country, but if you adjust for population size, it still ranks higher. Of these countries, Finland is next, with just 2 shootings over 14 years, but a much, much smaller population.
This is what's misleading. She specifically uses number of mass shootings, not victims or deaths, because even though you see this here, Norway and Finland are comparable relatively in frequency, they have a much higher death toll on average than American mass shootings.
Okay, so this is an interesting point. Now, this might come down to bias on my part, but personally, given that we're talking about literally 2 mass shootings from 2000 to 2014, it seems like we might have too small of a sample size for per capita statistics to be truly representative of the state of gun violence in a nation. But I'm not going to claim that I've completely debunked this point of Crowder's, as it's probably fair to say that Vox should have shown both graphs in the interest of fairness.
And this type of tragedy seems to be happening more often in the US.
They say seems to be an increase in mass shootings because what they don't tell you is that violent crime has decreased. Again, an umbrella non-defined term like mass shooting is much more easy to manipulate than the legal standard of crime.
When we get to this graph, it shows mass shootings excluding gang violence and domestic violence have been on the increase. Crowder's response to this is to point out that violent crime and gun crime are both dropping, which is kind of strange to me because that data, if anything, makes the data that shows mass shootings are going up seem even worse in context. He basically just throws the article at you, and then reiterates his unfounded assertion that mass shootings are just some umbrella, undefined term that is essentially meaningless, leaving the audience to assume that Vox has underhandedly manipulated the definitions to create irrelevant infographics. And hey, maybe number of mass shootings isn't the most important statistic, Chowbo, but you have to present an argument for it. You can't just pretend there's no definitions given for it and ignore it entirely. Like, look, here's the definition they're using. It's in your video.
Each of these squares represents a public mass shooting with 4 or more fatalities.
Like, come on, it's right there.
Before 2011, they happened 6 months apart on average. But since then, only 2 months go by between them.
This is interesting too, whereas before she was cherry-picking data, was kind of vague. All of a sudden, she's very specific in narrowing this criteria to psychopathic outliers whose name you will remember, like Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook.
Yeah, man, they point out major shootings in their data. It's okay, it's fine, man. It's just for context.
My tenure as president, to offer my condolences to families in these circumstances.
That was October 1st, 2015. And just about 2 months later...
Yesterday, a tragedy occurred in San Bernardino.
San Bernardino? Okay, hold on a second. I thought all these stats were excluding gang violence and terrorism. That was what they said at the outset.
Here, Crowder claims that we were told at the outset of the video that these graphs were going to exclude gang and terrorist violence. But the truth is, that is actually only true of the first 2 graphs. The third graph actually clearly shows that it excludes gang and domestic violence, rather than terrorist violence. Yes, as Crowder says, there are multiple definitions for what a mass shooting is, but since they are clearly labeled and in plain sight in the video, this isn't really an issue.
Public mass shootings get all the attention because they're often so indiscriminate. But the truth is, mass shootings are unlike most gun deaths in America. Here's how it breaks down. According to the most recent data, 92 people are killed with guns every day on average. About 30 of those are homicides, of which maybe 1.5 at most can be considered part of mass shootings.
Real quick, because we'll come back to this, 80% of those gun-related homicides in the United States are drug-related. Let's go.
Okay, so now the Vox video pivots to talking about more different types of gun violence, showing that most deaths are not from mass shootings. Steven decides to quickly throw in that 80% of gun homicides are drug-related. Now, I was interested to know what that term meant, so unlike how Steven treated Vox, I went searching for a definition in his sources. And I found this big long page of sources. It's all hyperlinked and texted up. Very nice work, Steven. So I clicked on the one that's supposed to correspond to the 80% claim. And the first thing I immediately noticed is that it directly discredits one of Steven's earlier points that mass shootings are irrelevant because gun violence is on decline. As funny as that was, though, I had to get to business, so I did a Control F for drug. And the only mention for drug in this entire page is actually describing the FBI's definition of a mass shooting. And in fact, the page he shows in his sources does not even look like the one that is shown in the video that's flashed up on screen. So it kind of makes me think there's some kind of mix-up, but I can't find the actual one he showed in the video, and I'm certainly not going to devote more than 30 seconds to trying. Or at least that's how the first draft of this video was going to go. Can't find the data, whatever, it's probably somewhere. Little joke that I'm lazy, that's it. Well, I'm still fucking lazy, but guess what? I decided to look it up, and this is not true at all. There is no source for this. So I did some digging around, and it seems like the reason that Steven's link does not match up at all with what he's saying it does in terms of sources is because it actually used to say what he says, but that has since been rescinded. You might be wondering why, and that's because that data is extremely incorrect. First off, no one else on the internet is even seemingly claiming that 80% of homicides are drug-related. The claim that actually pops up is that 80% of homicides are gang-related, which is also still untrue. You want to know where this statistic really came from? Well, it wasn't a study that showed that 80% of homicides are drug-related in the US. In fact, it was a study that 80% of homicide victims in Chicago are black. So, what the fuck? What the fuck? Now, in the second draft of this video, what I did was I just assumed that Crowder just threw in a random link to try and make his false claim appear real because he couldn't find any data to back it up. I now see that he actually just made the mistake of swallowing up bullshit wholesale. But that is a different mistake, so I did go back and change it. Now, I'm only saying this so that you can all marvel at my honesty. Thank you. There will now be a bit of silence for you to continue doing that.
Steven Crowder, you a bitch. Ay. Steven Crowder, you a bitch. Ay. Steven Crowder, you a bitch. Ay. Steven Crowder, you.
Most of those killed, 58 people a day, are suicides. The rest are accidental shootings, police actions, and undetermined incidents. Those suicides, they show up in international comparisons too. These are the 10 countries ranked highest on human development by the UN.
She wants to ignore that because we want to get to American suicide. Suicide is a terrible thing. But to use it as a political tool to remove law-abiding citizens' basic human right to self-preservation is pretty terrible too.
Hold on, I feel like we've done a bit of a leap here. Here Crowder is saying that taking away guns is the same as taking away one's basic right to self-preservation. It doesn't really look like he has a source for this in the video, and it doesn't seem like the kind of thing he would even think he had to back up. But as it turns out, there's actually not a lot of proof that guns make you safer. In fact, the evidence kind of bears out that guns make you less safe.
The reality is that per capita, the United States does not have an abnormally high suicide rate. Here are the countries that do. Surprise, many of these places are unfree countries with highly regulated gun control.
These are the 10 countries ranked highest on human development by the UN. The US has the highest suicide rate among them, and this darker bar shows how many of those are with guns.
So now the chart she cites is specifically countries ranked highest on human development from the UN.
So the next part of the Vox video addresses what a large chunk of gun deaths are accounted for by suicide. And we'll get to how that's important in a second, but first let's look at Cowboy's rebuttal, which is essentially to say, hey, look, all these other countries have higher suicide rates. And gee golly, some of them even have strict gun control. But wait a minute, what about all of the other factors that go into suicide rates? Are we not going to even think about those? But hold on, what if we had some way to compare countries in a more fair way? Some way that would reduce the noise of poverty, crime, and other factors as impacts on the suicide rate so that we could try and discern the effects of guns. Maybe we would, instead of just picking a list of all the countries, pick a list of only the most developed ones.
Not countries with the highest suicide rates. Not even developed countries, which you could say would be fair, you know, as opposed to comparing Zimbabwe and the United States. She picks a very specific vertical for what to include. Sorry, South Korea, Japan, and Poland, apparently you're not developed countries.
Yes, Crowder, they chose a specific vertical because it's actually a much fairer comparison than the one you're making. There are simply less variables unaccounted for. As we know, in science, we try and manipulate only one variable so that the result we get, we know, will reliably be attributed to the manipulation of that variable. So it only makes sense to reduce the number of variables by getting a vertical of similar countries. I'll grant you that it's not a perfect comparison, but given the huge discrepancy in the amount of gun suicides, it still speaks volumes. Oh, and also he throws in this little straw man that apparently Vox is claiming South Korea and Poland are not developed countries. Of course, you could say he's just being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, because it's all going to set up this hilarious joke.
That Samsung Galaxy is a figment of your imagination.
That face when the left can't meme. XD.
But to go and think that some type of gun control regulations that are being talked about are going to stop somebody from committing suicide when there's so many other ways for people to commit suicide.
But the methods that people use are important because suicide attempts often stem from temporary crises. The vast majority of people who survive suicide attempts don't end up dying from suicide, but guns make it nearly impossible to get that second chance. The victims of gun suicides are overwhelmingly men and mostly white.
So now we get into the personal stories to hit you right in the feels. I do understand that it might be hard to compare suicide rates across different countries because of cultural differences. So an example that you do have would be looking at Australia before and after the gun ban. And the suicide death rate remains virtually unchanged.
Crowder does acknowledge the difficulties with comparing two countries in terms of suicide rate. He doesn't really get into specifics, but, you know, Australia always had less guns. There was always a different culture around guns, so obviously they're not completely comparable. But what's interesting here is that Crowder says that the suicide rate basically has not gone down, virtually has not gone down, are the specific words he uses. Which is kind of interesting when you consider that that's a lie. He's lying. It's just not true. And, you know, obviously there would be other factors that would affect suicide rate other than the increased gun control in Australia. But again, the data does not show some sort of negligible difference in suicide death rate like Crowder seems to imply here. And despite the fact that this is one of his claims that is backed up with data shown in his video, he doesn't actually have a source for this anywhere in his sources. And by the way, that's not to say that we know definitively if the gun control measures in Australia did lower the suicide rate. In fact, the study says that it was actually not possible with the data they had to determine whether the change in firearm deaths could be attributed to the gun law reforms. But that's not the point that Crowder made. The point that Crowder made was that the suicide death rate remained virtually unchanged, which is just not true. And you might say, hey, aren't you being a bit pedantic? To which I reply, let's move on.
That's a decision you have to make. We have to move on because now there's a switch.
And the rate of gun suicides has been increasing in the US. At the same time, the rate of gun homicides has been decreasing, especially since the 90s when crime rates in general were higher. But if you compare the US to other developed countries, it doesn't look like good news. These are homicides adjusted for population size. The US would probably have a higher homicide rate even without guns, but you can see how gun violence pushes that rate far beyond the other countries here. The victims of these shootings, they're not the ones you often see on the national news. They're disproportionately young black men.
Just like that, we've switched from suicides to homicides without skipping a beat to make some kind of a racial point.
Steven, we've switched from suicides to homicides without skipping a beat because this video is about America's gun problem, not America's suicide problem or America's mass shooting problem. Several points throughout this video, Steven seems to have a problem with the idea that Vox is switching topics, and it's kind of baffling to me. It's not propaganda just because you can't keep up, man.
Again, 80% of homicides in the United States are drug-related.
So again, here we go on the screen. It doesn't even say drug-related, it says gang-related, and as we've already discussed, that is just not true. And you know what? Fine, let's pretend that that is actually a real statistic, which it's not. It's just completely not. But if it was, what would that even mean? You can't know just from the fact that it's gang-related that gun control wouldn't curb the amount of firearm deaths. And Steven makes no attempt at an argument to convince us of this. But again, not a real statistic, so not worth our time.
And the United States is nowhere near the top of any chart for murder rate or even firearm deaths.
Okay, Cobb, but have you seen the countries that the US is beating? It's not exactly the best lot here. Again, if you compare the US to countries that are similar in terms of development, there's a lot of room for improvement.
Statistically, gang members aren't buying their heat at Walmart.
So this is a bit of a throwaway joke line from Crowder, but I think it suggests that he actually has this conception that a lot of people do, which is that gang members or criminals in general tend to get their weapons from illegal sources, which is actually not always true. So yes, among prisoners who carried a firearm during the offense for which they were serving time, in 1997, 14% had bought or traded a gun from a store, pawn shop, flea market, or gun show. And then the 1991 percentage for that same statistic was around 21%. So at the first glance, this actually does seem to support what Crowder is saying, but if we go over to just beside that, we get to see another graph which gives a bit more perspective into that statistic. Because here's the thing. Buying a gun from a retailer is not the only way to legally acquire a gun. So we can see here that criminals tend to get their guns actually most often from friends or family, and then shortly followed by a street or illegal source. And now it's worth mentioning that some of those retail purchases may not have been legal, they could have been fraudulently done, and it's also true that some of those friends or family transactions could be illegal. However, it still paints a much different picture than the initial 21 or 14% statistic does, so I thought it'd be worth mentioning. And it will also show up a bit later, so keep your ears peeled.
Side note, Chicago has some of the strictest gun laws in the country, also the highest homicide rate.
Okay, so there's a couple things wrong with this. First of all, once again, we're not considering any context here. It's kind of hard to just look at two statistics and find a proper correlation, as we know. Chicago has a lot of problems, and not only that, you have to consider the gun control laws in the neighboring states, which is a large way that guns come into Illinois. So law enforcement officials said that 60% of the guns confiscated on the streets of Chicago come from Indiana, Wisconsin, and Mississippi. That being said, the idea that Chicago has the strictest gun laws in the country is not true anymore. There was a point when that was true, but since 2010, Chicago's gun laws have been getting more and more relaxed. Also worth mentioning, an important counterexample in New York, which in fact has stricter gun laws on the books than Chicago, with its homicide numbers trending towards historic lows. Again, we'd need more context for that statistic to mean much, but it is a good counterexample to Crowder's.
Steven Crowder, you a bitch. Ay. Steven Crowder, you a bitch. Ay. Steven Crowder, you a bitch. Ay.
One possible explanation is that the US simply has more crime than those other countries. But if you set aside homicides for a moment and look at rates of burglary or assault, you don't see that same spike that you see with homicide.
This is why it's important to know when you're being manipulated when someone's switching between stats that include gang violence and terrorism until they don't.
Again, Crowder, it's not propaganda just because you can't keep up. So far throughout this video, Vox has been transparent in what their stats do and do not include. Maybe if it wasn't labeled anywhere in the video or the source, I would agree with you, but it is.
They don't. Because yes, the United States certainly has more gang-on-gang crime. Europe has a startling trend of more predator against defenseless victim crime.
Whoa there, that's kind of out of left field. Crowder randomly brings up this whole migrant crime thing in Europe, and that's a whole other can of worms that I don't really have time to get into in this video, but I consider a cardinal sin to ever non-ironically invoke Breitbart. And of course, we've got to keep in mind that Steven has used bad statistics previously in this video to conclude that America's crime problem can be chalked up to gang violence.
A big factor for that we'll address later on in this video that she never mentions.
It's not that America has much more crime. It's that crime in the US is much more lethal. Altogether, the number of gun deaths in the US from 2000 to 2013 exceeds the number of Americans killed by AIDS, by illegal drug overdoses, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and terrorism combined. It should be clear by now that this level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world.
First off, why did she throw AIDS in there? AIDS is not a serious problem for most Americans unless involved in, shall we say, very specific activities.
Well, Crowder, they included AIDS in that list because in 2014, 6,721 people died from HIV. Oh, but you just wanted to make a joke at the expense of gay people. That's cool. Fuck you.
Why would you include drugs on that list, but not the fact that 80% of gun homicides are drug-related? Also, how are war casualties not gun-related? Is this only mortar fire? Is it waterboarding outliers? What? I'm also imagining this would be skewed, considering that San Bernardino would be included down here and not up here with terrorism.
Alright, so again, in the first draft of this video, I wasn't really going to address this claim. I didn't really know what to do about it. But I decided as I was making it to see where Vox got their statistics from and if these statistics actually did include San Bernardino. So I googled around and I found a similar kind of graph from a CNN article which compiled similar data. And what I quickly realized was that I am fucking stupid and San Bernardino was in 2015 and these statistics are clearly from 2000 to 2013. So pretty definitive answer here for you, Crowder. They did exclude San Bernardino because it hadn't fucking happened yet.
It should be clear by now that this level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world.
This is important here because she finishes on the words gun violence, but this big scary black bar is not indicative of gun violence. It's total firearm-related deaths. That's important because when comparing actual gun homicide rates worldwide, the United States only ranks 28th.
Yes, only 28th. That's great, Crowder. It's great. You're right. You have destroyed Vox. No, really, though, I once again instruct you to consider the status of the countries that the U.S. is beating in terms of gun homicides. There's no reason why the world's greatest superpower cannot rise above this kind of competition.
This is a pivotal sleight of hand here because this includes total firearm deaths right before she pivots.
This level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world. And here's one reason why. There are a ton of guns in the U.S. This chart shows the estimated number of guns by country. It's adjusted for population size, and it's still not even close.
Ah, see, now this chart is comparing countries. But this chart is not about homicide. It's not about firearm deaths. It's only about gun ownership. All of this is designed to lead you into believing that gun ownership, legal gun ownership, results in increased violent gun crime.
No, Crowder, it's meant to lead you into believing that more gun ownership results in more gun deaths. And it's already addressed that there are several types of gun deaths, including suicide and mass shootings, as well as homicides. I wouldn't call this a sleight of hand trick. I'd lean more towards getting to the point, but whatever.
Important to note, if gun ownership, as seen in this chart, is so much higher, but the United States still ranks 28th in gun-related deaths, why is that the case? It also ironically unravels her own point. If gun ownership is so drastically higher in the United States, but we're only 28th ranked in overall gun homicide rate, that means proportionally legal gun owners in the United States are committing fewer crimes.
Look how happy he is when he thinks he stumbled across a point. It's kind of adorable in a way. And you know, Crowder's not using a study here, he's just using his own ticker, but I'm perfectly willing to grant him that, say, gun owners in America will generally kill less people than gun owners in, like, El Salvador, but Obviously, that's not a fair comparison. Honestly, I don't even know what to say against this kind of repeated nonsense anymore. He keeps just wanting to take any context out of these kinds of statistics, but once again, if you put the US against other wealthy countries, they do terribly in comparison.
If you take a look back at the 10 countries with the highest levels of human development, you can see that it's really easy to get a gun in the US. All of the other countries require a license to purchase most guns, and those purchases are recorded into an official registry. To get that license, people have to state a reason for why they want a gun. And in most of these countries, they have to pass a safety test and are required by law to store their guns safely.
Tyrant like, I don't know, say Hitler. Something else to note, along with the 80% drug-related gun homicide, is most gun crime occurs in heavily populated areas, urban areas, big cities. And the United States has more big cities than many countries on this list combined.
So I looked around, and according to NEMA.com, I don't know.
Norway had an 81% urban population, Switzerland 74.1, Netherlands 91.5, Canada 82.2, Germany 75.7, 63.8 for Ireland, New Zealand at 86.4, and the US at 82.
So it would appear that Krillo's little urban centers/cities example may not help his case that much. Of course, maybe this increased crime only applies to specifically big cities and not just urban areas, but Crowder didn't give a source for this claim, so this is the best I can do to rebut it.
Steep, scary graph is designed to plant the idea in your head that more legal gun owners equals more gun crime. Not true. Matter of fact, in a study in 1994, they found that only 21% of gun crimes involved a firearm purchase through a store or traditional outlet, meaning legally.
No, Crowder, not meaning legally. There are other legal ways to get a gun, as we've gone over earlier. See, guys, I told you it would come back up. He also says that only 21% of gun crimes were committed with a gun purchased from a store, but actually what the study looked at was of the people who were incarcerated and had a gun on them during their last offense, how many of them got them guns from retail or other sources. In essence, not necessarily a gun crime. And as I said before, 40% of those inmates got their guns from friends or family. Of course, some of those friends or family transactions could have been illegal, as well as some of the gun retail transactions could be illegal, but it's also worth considering that some of those illegally gained guns would have been purchased by legal means, and then stolen, leading to perhaps a greater chance of violent gun crime. So you'd have a mechanism where legal gun purchase could still lead to violent gun crime, aside from the ways that it currently does, which is just people legally buying guns and then doing crime, which, you know, does happen.
The most recent study would suggest that it's closer to between 3 and 11%. There's a variance because these issues are kind of hard to study. Felons aren't known for their truthful integrity.
Hold on, wait a minute. That's a PolitiFact page which rates that claim as half true. Let's not gloss over it like Steven did, and instead look at what it actually says. The 3% figure comes from a study of 99 inmates from Chicago who were selected to be a sample of gun-involved, criminally active men living in Greater Chicago. If that sounds like it doesn't represent all criminals, that's because it doesn't. Even the authors of the study warned against taking these data too far, saying, "We do not place much emphasis on the statistical results, as opposed to the qualitative patterns that emerge from the data." The 3% figure represents the amount of inmates that purchased a gun from a store, but again, that's not the only legal way to get a gun. Gifts from family, private sales, and other legal methods are also possible. If we wanted a more representative study, we could look to the one conducted in 2004 by the Bureau of Justice. This one shows that about 11% had bought the firearm at a retail store, pawn shop, flea market, or a gun show, and another 37% had gotten it from a friend or family member. And again, 40% said they got it illegally on the black market from a drug dealer or by stealing it.
So we've looked at gun deaths and at gun ownership. This chart puts them together. It shows that among highly developed countries, the more guns in a country, the more gun deaths. You can see that countries like Switzerland, which have relatively more guns than a country like the Netherlands, also have a higher gun death rate. And here's the US.
See the sleight of hand? We were just talking about homicide and gun purchases. Now we're back to gun deaths, not homicide or violent crime, because those would include suicides or violent intruders or criminals being killed by law-abiding gun-owning homeowners.
Likewise, US states with more guns have more gun homicides. There are outliers like Idaho, which has higher rates of gun ownership but low rates of gun murders. But overall, there's a correlation between gun ownership and homicide rates. And that relationship has held up in studies that control for things like poverty, unemployment, and crime.
Actually, no. Those outliers can be explained because there's a strong correlation between gun deaths and big populated cities and gang violence. That's why the sleight of hand is important. Sometimes she includes it, sometimes she doesn't.
Okay, so this is kind of weird here. What he's saying here is basically that bigger cities tend to have more gun ownership, but the gun ownership has nothing to do with the increased amount of gun crime. It's just the fact that it's a big city. So not only does he not have a source for this, it doesn't even make any sense. This is the kind of claim that you would definitely need a study for, and he's not provided anything. He's also still complaining about the graphs now including gang violence, when we haven't even seen a graph that excluded gang violence since like 13 minutes ago in this video. Just to spell it out one last time for you, Steven, most of the mass shooting data excluded gang violence, but the rest of the data does not. This is clearly labeled and deeply, deeply not a secret or sleight of hand trick. The reason that Vox excluded gang violence in the first place is because that's what sources that compile mass shooting data do. They're using real data, okay?
If this particular study doesn't include big cities but poverty, it renders it irrelevant because poverty is still the biggest indicator for violent crime, far more so than mere gun ownership.
Okay, Steven, yes, poverty is a greater indicator for violent crime than gun ownership. But I think we need to stop for a minute and do some quick maths just to explain to you why that's not a good point. Okay, you see here, let's say this number 1 represents violent crime. So let's multiply that by a large number, say 30, like how old Crowder is. Now let's multiply that number by a smaller number, like 3, the estimated diameter of Crowder's balls in micrometers. So we notice that this number is actually different than the number we would get if we excluded the ball data. Do you get it, Crowder? Just because it's a smaller factor does not mean you can ignore it.
The correlation between gun ownership and gun deaths is even stronger for suicides. It makes sense.
No, it doesn't. None of it does. Look behind you. There's what made sense.
Depression with a gun is more dangerous than depression without one.
Okay, this again brings us back to the fact that the United States does not have an abnormally high suicide rate. So now she wants to blame the conjoining of guns and depression. But earlier she admitted that middle-aged white men make up an abnormally high percentage of the suicide rate, even though women are more likely to suffer from depression.
Okay, let's see here. Men commit suicide the most, but women suffer from depression more. The result of this is that women tend to attempt suicide a lot more than men do, but men tend to die from suicide a lot more. Now, why is there that discrepancy there? Why do women attempt suicide more, but men die more? Well, if we look at the data here, it says that women attempt suicide more, but are less successful because they use less lethal methods. Men are more likely to use hanging, carbon monoxide poisoning, or firearms. This pretty clearly fits in with the previously mentioned study that firearms contribute to the amount of suicides. And I dare say it corroborates it.
So again, the mind trickery. We've gone from blaming the gun to now blaming depression and the gun, which counteracts her previous statement on suicides to begin with.
Again here, and I'm sorry that I have to say again here so much, but again here, Steven misunderstands the nature of what factors do. Yes, guns are a factor that lead to increased suicide deaths, but so is depression. There's no conflict here, Steven.
Likewise, fights, domestic disputes, road rage, drunkenness, all much more dangerous with a gun than without. That said, you might need different policies to keep guns away from potential mass shooters than you would to keep them out of inner city gangs or out of the hands of someone who might hurt themselves. America doesn't have a gun problem. It has several of them.
Steven Crowder, you a bitch. Ay. 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 Steven Crowder, you a bitch.
Okay, so here's the big takeaway. This video has equally represented mass shootings, suicide, and gang violence as though they proportionally contribute to the gun-related problem. Despite the fact that 80% of gun homicides in the United States are drug-related, despite the fact that the biggest indicators of gun crime are big, populated areas and poverty, despite the fact that the United States is not even in the top 25 in firearm-related deaths, despite the fact that the United States does not have an abnormally high suicide rate, despite the fact that with increased legal gun ownership, gun crime has actually steadily declined, and despite the fact that Vox had a beautiful canvas to work with at the outset by using the umbrella term mass shooting, which was completely undefined and even included acts of terrorism like San Bernardino. It's one thing to get your information wrong. It's another to deliberately mislead people because the facts don't stack up with your narrative. How could you fix that problem? That's important. They've already shown you. It wouldn't be some kind of an arbitrary assault weapons ban, which really these weapons don't comprise of most of this gun violence anyway. It wouldn't be some kind of a limitation on magazine capacities. It would have to be, of course, an all-out gun ban, declaring that you legally do not have the right to self-preservation, which is in fact what several Supreme Court justices argued before the High Court, that none of you have the right to own firearms, period, for any reason unless your jurisdiction deems it so. But don't worry, you're just crazy thinking that people like Vox want to take your guns away.
Stephen Crowder, you a bitch. Stephen Crowder, you a bitch. Stephen Crowder, you.
Yeah, so that was the video. When I went into it, I didn't expect to be able to like debunk so much of what he said. I expected there to be like some things that were hard for me to address, but there really wasn't anything. There was a bit about this particular woman telling her story about how her son died to gun violence, that Stephen was like, oh, it's gang violence, that I decided to omit because I didn't really have anything to say about that. But aside from that, this video was fairly comprehensive, and Crowder didn't really get any good points, which I was actually surprised, even as someone who dislikes him. That all being said, I'm sure I made some mistakes in this video. Just going through it several times, I noticed stuff that I had to go back and correct, and I'm sure I didn't catch everything. So feel free to leave a comment down below if you think I messed something up, because I'm sure I did. Keep it classy though. Don't get too mean in there, because I'll shoot you if you are too rude. So thank you.
Stephen Crowder, you a bitch. Stephen Crowder, you a bitch. Stephen Crowder, you a bitch. Hey, Stephen Crowder, you a bitch. You a bitch. Stephen Crowder, you a bitch. Stephen Crowder, you a bitch. You a bitch. You a bitch. Stephen Crowder, 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 you a bitch. You a